If you ask a British person what novels they associate with Enid Blyton, they'll likely say the famous 5 books. I know this because I found a British person, lured him into my home and asked that exact question. What novels do you associate with Enid Blyton? Sorry.
The famous 5.
However, if, like me, you grew up in Germany, there's only one name that comes to mind at the mention of Enid Blyton. Well, it's actually 2 names. This is the story of how one of the most well-beloved children's book series of the 20th century is built on a lie. It's the story of some of the weirdest translation choices you can imagine and the consequences of those choices. It's also the story of spoiled, rebellious twin sisters who get sent to boarding school where they learn the value of meekness and other important life lessons. They learn to be humble and kind and make real friendships, while very occasionally breaking the rules just a little bit in a teacher-approved fashion. It's gender roles and lacrosse on the curriculum. Wait, is it lacrosse? These twins are of course called Patricia and
Nanni.
Isabel. If you grew up in Germany, you know exactly who these girls are. Maybe you know them like this. Or like this. Or like this. Either way, Hanni and Nanni are a household name in Germany. According to a representative of the Schneider Publishing House in 2010, these books have sold over 14 million copies since the 60s. And they're only getting more popular with each new adaptation that hits the German cinemas, with the most recent one coming out in 2016. What you might not know is that these characters were first introduced to the world in a series of very English boarding school novels written in the early 1940s by Enid Blyton, who of course started the trend of being a terrible person while publishing best-selling children's fiction. The first book in the series, from 1941, bears the title The Twins at St. Clare's, which, while not nearly exciting enough to pique the interest of the clickbait generation these days, is at least pretty descriptive. It's the story of twins who go to a school called St. Clare's. There were 5 more books in the series, all with similarly thrilling titles such as Summer Term at St. Clare's and Second Form at St. Clare's. The 6th and final book in the series, Fifth Formers of St. Clare's, was published in 1945. Then Enid Blyton went on to write her much more successful but similarly themed Mallory Towers books about a boarding school called, you guessed it, Mallory Towers. Much more successful? Really? Yes, at least in the UK. But wait, you might say, if you're among the roughly 3% of my audience watching this from Germany. What about the other 20 or so novels in the Hanni and Nanni series? Like the one where the twins rescue some horses, or the one where they help run a B&B, or the one about the school trip to Mallorca. Ah yes, you might want to sit down for this. You see, these are the books Enid Blyton never wrote. Hello and welcome to Spinster's Library. I'm Claudia, and today I want to tell you about how several generations of German readers were straight up lied to in the name of Hanni and Nanni. Germans have always had a thing for boarding school novels. Maybe that's because boarding schools are really uncommon here. According to the British Council, there are about 500 boarding schools in the UK, whereas Germany only has about 150. If you're in the UK, chances are you know someone who went to boarding school and turned out an entitled prick. Chances are someone who went to boarding school runs the company you work for, or the council of the town in which you live. Chances are someone who went to boarding school runs your entire country. In Germany, we're a bit more detached from boarding schools, which gives them an aura of intrigue. We think of them as these exclusive places of privilege and learning, but also of freedom from parents and home life. Places we, as children, might have wanted to escape to. So of course they're popular settings for children's books, and not just in Germany. But there's something about boarding schools that has captured German readers in particular, and that has made them popular in children's literature for well over a century. There's classics such as Der Trotzkopf by Emmy von Roden, a now nearly forgotten classic from 1885 that was hugely successful at the end of the 19th century, in which a rebellious girl goes to boarding school and learns to be meek and gentle and follow the rules. Sounds vaguely familiar? I absolutely adored this one as a child, even though it's a big, archaic novel about gender roles I knew even then I didn't particularly care for. There's Das fliegende Klassenzimmer by Erich Kästner, an absolute staple of German children's literature. Published in 1933, oddly one of the few books of his that wasn't banned by the Nazis. This trend really exploded in the 60s and 70s, which saw a whole avalanche of boarding school novels, marketed mainly at girls, about girls who go to boarding school. Examples include Ulrike kommt ins Internat from 1963 or Wirbel im Internat from 1971, both by Marie-Louise Fischer. Yes, Internat is German for boarding school. Well done, monolinguals, for working that one out. Anyway, these are all fairly predictable stories about girls who don't want to go to boarding school, get sent to boarding school, hate boarding school, then have the time of their life in boarding school. If I didn't know any better, I'd suspect the unsavory involvement of some sort of boarding school lobby, trying to brainwash German children into, wanting to go to boarding school. But, as previously stated, boarding schools play an absolutely minuscule part in the makeup of the German education system. So I doubt it's big boarding school pushing this trend. These are the books I grew up reading. All of them were gifted to me by a kindly friend of my mother's. She used to come round with big bags full of novels that she presumably read during her own childhood and was happy not to have to throw in the recycling bin. Shout out to Gisela at this point, you're a superstar. Thanks to her, I was exposed to the many, many novels about girls going to boarding school that populated the children's section of West German bookshops in the second half of the 20th century. It's against this background that Enid Blyton's 1941 novel The Twins at St. Clare's was translated into German and published by the Franz Schneider Publishing House in 1965. The title got a bit of an upgrade, but that's not the only thing that was different. Oh no. This translation changes so many things about the original text, it makes you wonder whether this and this are the same book at all. If Hanni und Nanni are felled in the woods and there's no one there to hear... Wait, that's the wrong metaphor. The twins, whom Enid Blyton named Patricia and Isabel O'Sullivan, got renamed Hannah and Marianne Sullivan, nicknamed Hanni and Nanni. Just Sullivan. Nothing Irish going on here. I should also point out that Isabel and Patricia are perfectly German-sounding names already. There was no need to change them, but what do I know? The very English St. Clare's School becomes the very German-sounding Lindenhof, while Patricia and Isabel O'Sullivan are described as having a pleasant Irish lilt in the original. Hanni and Nanni Sullivan don't seem to be from any particular place at all. At St. Clare's, the girls play lacrosse. At Lindenhof, it's handball. It kind of makes sense. I played handball in school, whereas the only thing I know about lacrosse is from that scene at the end of the movie Mean Girls, which is probably not very accurate. Also, and I can only speculate why this was done, the characters were aged down from 14 in the original to 12 in the translation. My guess is that it's because Germans don't generally go to a new school at 14, so aging them down to 12 and then sending them to a new school might have been more familiar to a West German reader who would typically start secondary school aged 11. It's really weird reading this German translation now and seeing just how much the Englishness was stripped from the original novel. Listen to this bit here where the twins pack their trunks for their journey to school. And look, lacrosse sticks instead of hockey sticks, said Isabel in disgust. They might at least play hockey as well as lacrosse. I didn't even bother to look at the lacrosse sticks Mummy bought for us, did you? And look, we're even told what to bring in our tuck boxes. We could take what we like to Red Roof's. Just wait till we get to St. Clare's. We'll show that we can do as we like, said Pat. What time is the train tomorrow? 10 o'clock from Paddington, said Isabel. Well, we shall get our first glimpse of the St. Clare girls there. I bet there'll be a queer-looking crowd. Mrs. O'Sullivan took the twins to London. They taxied to Paddington Station and looked for the St. Clare train. You can tell from these few paragraphs just how English this book is. So, what did German translator Christa Kupfer make with that? She basically rewrote this entire bit. The conversation about the cross sticks simply doesn't happen. It's just cut from the dialogue. When Nanni asks when the train is, Hanni says it's the 10 o'clock from Hofkirchen, which is a tiny village in Bavaria that doesn't even have a train station. In the original, Enid Blyton makes a point of mentioning the grey coats the St. Clare's girls wear for a school uniform. There's no mention of school uniforms in the German translation because they're just not a thing here. We're barely 2 chapters in and the illusion already falls apart. There are no school trains in Germany that take rich kids to boarding school. This whole scene, where the girls go to Paddington Station to meet the other students and teachers, it just doesn't make sense outside this very specific early 20th century British upper middle class context. But my girl Christa does not let the trivialities of time and place discombobulate her. In this translation, she creates a weird world in which school trains exist alongside handball matches, where the characters have German first names but English surnames, where the very rigidly Anglican world of an English boarding school is replaced with what exactly? There's no German equivalent to this, so the translator just makes it up as she goes along. She clearly had the time of her life with these translations, in particular with character names. Her baseline approach is to change only the first names to sound more German. Hilary Wentworth becomes Hilda Wentworth. Kathleen Gregory is now Katrin Gregory. The girls are taught by Fräulein Kennedy, Fräulein Roberts and Fräulein Lewis. I cannot wrap my brain around the rationale for this. Even weirder are the names that Christa Kupfer didn't change. Winifred James is just Winifred James. But my favourite name translation is that of Belinda Towers, the temperamental upper form lacrosse captain. In the German translation, she's called Linda Turm. That's right, monolinguals. Turm is German for tower. In her 2011 thesis on Hanni und Nanni, Romy Langer puts together this graph to show how many of the names were changed in the German translations. You can see that most of the names have been substituted, which means replaced with a different name altogether. Langer also writes up a really interesting list of other choices made by the translator. Some are straight up mistakes, like the mention of tea, which in this context denotes a meal, not a drink. Americans, you'll just have to trust me on that. In the German translation, this meal suddenly becomes a cup of coffee. There are other bits where the translator just added whole paragraphs to the story that simply aren't there in the original. Usually backstory or world building, but the audacity. Reading the English and German versions side by side, these absurd translation choices are glaring. But reading these books as a child, I wasn't even aware that they were supposed to be set in a whole other country. I didn't question the school train, or the prominence of team sports on the curriculum, or why the only foreign language they learn is French. If you think about the day-to-day at Lindenhof for just a minute, it should be very obvious that this is not a German school. But the translations didn't just mess with the setting on a superficial level. Oh no, the whole background of the English class system, the way it rigidly underpins every interaction, every plot point in the St. Clare's books, gets entirely lost in translation. On the very first page, there's a conversation the twins are having with their friends about which schools they want to go to. "I do wish you were coming to Ringmere School with us," said Frances. "It's such a nice, exclusive school," our mother says. "You know, only girls of rich parents, very well bred, go there, and you make such nice friends." Monolinguals, you'll just have to believe me when I say there's no direct German translation of well bred here. You can say well-educated or well-raised or even wealthy. But this phrase, girls of rich parents, very well bred, carries a particularly British meaning. You see, anyone can be rich, can be wealthy in the UK, but only a few get to be upper class, or more likely here, upper middle class. It's an exclusive club that Patricia and Isabel belong to, but Hanni and Nanni probably don't. In an article for Tralalit, which is a German language magazine about translation studies, Lucia Marianovic points out another class marker that disappeared in translation. In the original novels, Patricia and Isabel O'Sullivan's family employ live-in maids. But the German translation leaves out any mention of them, once again declassing these characters, taking them out of their time and place and societal context. There's a plotline in the second half of the book about a girl who's very obviously from a working class family that's recently come into great wealth. If there's one thing the British middle classes hate, it's people who they think should stay poor actually getting rich. So the girls aren't particularly fond of Sheila and her arrogant ways. "You didn't ought to talk like that," began Sheila in a mincing voice, and Janet flung down her book in a rage. "Hark at Sheila! Didn't ought to? Good heavens, Sheila, where were you brought up? Haven't you learnt by now that decent people don't say didn't ought to? My goodness, you talk about your servants and your Rolls-Royce cars, your horse and your lake and goodness knows what, and then you talk like the daughter of the dustman." It's hard to tell in the scene what offends Janet more, Sheila showing off or her audacity in doing so in what's undoubtedly supposed to be a Cockney accent. Several things were changed about this scene in the German translation. For one, as previously stated, there's no mention of Sheila's, or Suze's as she's called here, servants. There's no servants in the world of Hanni and Nanni, even though they most certainly exist in the original St. Clare's books. The Rolls-Royce is also changed to a Mercedes. But more importantly, the linguistic faux pas that marks Sheila out as a working class girl just doesn't make sense in the German translation. There is a clumsy attempt at making her trip up with some wrong vocabulary, but all of the markers of class that are oh so important in the UK version are erased. If you're interested in a more detailed analysis of these translations, I refer you to the magazine article and the dissertation that I've quoted. They're both linked down below, though please note that both sources are in German. So we have 6 badly translated books here. Big deal, right? But wait, there's more. In addition to publishing these 6 original Enid Blyton novels, unrecognizable though they might be in German, the Franz Schneider publishing house also started adding to the series. Starting in 1971, they commissioned ghostwriters to write more books about these twins at their boarding school. This continues into the 1980s, with more and more Hanni and Nanni books hitting the bookshelves in West Germany and Austria, and I presume also in Switzerland, though I have not been able to find conclusive information about that. If you're Swiss and frequented bookshops a few decades ago, do let me know if you were also sold these fake Enid Blyton books. You too may be entitled to compensation. Because here's the thing, these were published as perfectly legitimate parts of the St. Clare series. The names of the actual authors who wrote these aren't mentioned anywhere on the covers or the front matter of these books. In her thesis on Hanni and Nanni, Romy Langer recounts an anecdote about translator Cornelia Kunz-Arnold, who actually contacted the German publisher in the 1970s wondering where these new stories were coming from. And they straight up lied and told her that the new books were actually just bits they'd left out of the translations of the original Enid Blyton ones. Deleted scenes basically, but definitely written by Enid Blyton herself. The dodginess doesn't end here. If you look at one of the Hanni and Nanni books that was written and produced in Germany for the German-speaking market, you wouldn't even notice that this is not one of the original novels written by Enid Blyton. Hanni und Nanni im Landschulheim is the 15th book in the series chronology, published in 1971. If that wasn't enough of a clue, the title certainly should be, because Landschulheim is such a uniquely German word that I'm struggling to think of an English translation for it. Nope, there isn't one. A Landschulheim is a sort of a hostel that exists purely for school trips, where children go with their entire school class and stay for several days, usually a week. For many German children, this is the first time being away from their parents for any length of time. It's supposed to bond a school class closer together and also, of course, provide them with the opportunity for lots of usually hiking-based excursions. I went to a few such trips during my secondary school days, the first one being in 6th grade when I was 11. Anyway, the book Hanni und Nanni im Landschulheim is set during their very last year at Lindenhof. The twins and their friends, now young adults, are asked to look after some children at a Landschulheim that's being used as a sort of summer camp during the school holidays. So I suppose if I was to translate the title, I'd call it The Twins at Summer Camp. If you look at the cover design for this, it's practically indistinguishable from the books that are actual translations of real Enid Blyton books. The author's name is right here, as if this was a new work from her own pen, even though she'd been dead for a good 3 years at this point. If you open it up to here, it tells you what other books in this series have previously been published, both Enid Blyton authored titles and new German ones all listed together, and at the bottom it says the English originals have been published by Methuen & Co Limited, London. And right next to it, German edit, Franz Schneider Verlag, the German publisher. It doesn't name the author who actually wrote this book, because it certainly wasn't Enid Blyton. The only clue that this is not a translation is that there's no translator credited here. Unlike the first book where it says German translation Christa Kupfer. But even that isn't conclusive, because if you look at this edition from 1970, which contains the last 3 of Enid Blyton's original novels, the translator's name is also conveniently left out of the front matter. This is deceptive, right? At no point in these German-produced additions to the St. Clare series does the publisher admit that that's what they are. Ghost-written novels for the German-speaking market. The Franz Schneider publishing house doesn't exist anymore. It was sold to the Danish Egmont Group in 1985, which then sold it to HarperCollins in 2020. That means that there is currently no official online presence for Hanni und Nanni. No original source. Which is a shame, because I'd love to know how they would market this series' messy history today. The Franz Schneider Verlag's approach to the Hanni und Nanni books in the 70s and 80s is weirdly incohesive. On the one hand, they erase all traces of Britishness from the translated texts, but on the other, they slap Enid Blyton's name on stories she certainly had no hand in creating. But so far, the weirdest artifact in my little collection is this book, which I recently and randomly found on the street in the German village I call home these days. Happy Adventures with Hanni and Nanni was published in 1973, after Schneider had already started churning out fake Hanni und Nanni books. What this is a retranslation into English of the first novel, which, if you remember from all the way at the beginning of the video, is called The Twins at St. Clare's in the original, and Hanni und Nanni sind immer dagegen in the translation. On the blurb, this says, "For the first time ever, a German children's publishing house releases an English children's book in the original language." This edition features vocabulary lists at the bottom of every page, with words that a German child who's been learning English at school might find difficult. The blurb suggests that this is basically the original The Twins at St. Clare's, just as Enid Blyton wrote it. Right? You should know better by now. As you might have guessed from the title, Happy Adventures with Hanni and Nanni, the twins' names have not been changed back to Patricia and Isabel. Though what's weird is that the O has been reintroduced into the surname, creating Hanni and Nanni O'Sullivan. That, by the way, remains the only hint of their Irish background, because the line about their accent is still missing from this edition. What's even more cheeky, and you almost have to respect the publisher for doing that. This book stops right in the middle of the 6th chapter, which is about a quarter of the way through the original novel. It just stops. Right after the St. Clare's girls have played a hilarious prank on Poor Miss Kennedy, involving explosives in the classroom fireplace, which probably left poor Miss Kennedy on prescription anxiety medication for the rest of her life. Then on the very last page, the publisher writes, "Oh dear, now things are getting rather unpleasant. If you want to know how the story continues, do buy the sequel, Happy Adventures with Hanni and Nanni 2. Unbelievable. Incidentally, this is the only unloved version of these books in my possession. You can tell this one was never even opened by the original owner, let alone read. It simply spent a few lonely decades in a box in someone's basement until it was finally put outside by the side of the road for me to find and rescue it, poor thing." The last fake Hanni and Nanni book was published in 2015, with a cover design that really sets it apart from the iconic 20th century illustrations, and notably, Enid Blyton's name is added almost as an afterthought, squeezed onto this price tag, which shows the level of self-awareness that surprised me a little. It just shows how much these books have captured German readers from the mid-60s onwards. There was even an anime series based on Enid Blyton's original novels, which was broadcast in Japan in 1991 and in Germany in 1997. I watched repeat after repeat of these episodes in the late 90s, about the same time as I was reading these books. Interestingly enough, the St. Clare's anime never got an English dub. Probably because the St. Clare's books never had the same big cultural impact in the UK that they had abroad. But it did get broadcast in some other countries, including Italy, Spain, Mexico, and the Philippines. Because the anime is an adaptation of Enid Blyton's original books, the girls do actually play lacrosse instead of handball. I never even noticed that as a child. What can I say? I was not particularly bright. The books, both Enid Blyton's original books and the fake German ones, were also adapted very successfully as German audio dramas, which were sold on cassette tape and later on CD, and were a must-have on German family road trips. This series of audio dramas is still being produced, with more and more being written by German author Andre Minninger, who also writes the massively popular Drei Fragezeichen series. There are currently 79 Hanni und Nanni audio dramas, with the latest one published just last year. As you can see, Hanni und Nanni's popularity in Germany did not diminish after I had outgrown these books. In 2010, the first German adaptation hit the cinemas, with 3 sequels to follow. I didn't watch these films since I was very much not the target audience when they came out, so I have no idea whether they're accurate to the books or not, or if they're even any good. But they were certainly successful. I don't know what the future brings for Hanni und Nanni. More audio dramas, certainly, and perhaps more movie adaptations. I'm kind of hoping for at least one English language adaptation of the original St. Clare's books, but Enid Blyton is a curiously little adapted author, considering the impact of her works in the UK. There is a new adaptation of The Magic Faraway Tree in production at the moment, which might spark new interest or it might not. I'd really like to see a St. Clare's adaptation set in the time of the original books, the early 1940s. Make it gritty if you want. Do what the books don't and mention the war. It would be an interesting approach to these original texts, which might otherwise not appeal to a modern audience with their stuffy, old-fashioned ideals. I guess we'll see. We've made it to the end of the video I've literally been wanting to record for years. The hardest thing turned out to be getting hold of a copy of this. My mother-in-law, who has a respectable collection of Enid Blyton books at her house, all from her own childhood, could not find this particular novel. Then I found a copy on a German secondhand book marketplace, but the seller who'd put the listing up couldn't find her copy either. I ended up finally snatching up this one for stupidly cheap, and because I didn't trust online booksellers after my last attempt, I also bought a second one. This one's going to be sent to my mother-in-law so she can add it to her library. Let me know if you too read these books as children, whether it's St. Clare's or Hanni und Nanni. If you're German, did you ever notice a difference between the translations of the original Enid Blyton novels and the ghostwritten ones? I don't think I ever did, but then my standards weren't particularly high as a 7-year-old. Let me know about your standards in the comments. Thank you for watching. Bye!